Bonjour.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this second roundtable discussion for these meetings in Aix-en-Seine because we've had to relocate because of the circumstances. So we are live with Lionel Fontagné and his guests. So we've entitled this session, Should We Be Up in Arms Over Globalization or Backlash to Globalization? So this crisis has this crisis called into question globalization and its effects, because we've seen a number of countries adopt social distancing, but from a geopolitical perspective by closing their borders. We've seen the also calling into question the relocation of a number of industries. So there's been a lot of talk about the possibility of reshoring some essential or critical industries, not only drugs, but also the automotive industry or aerospace. So for this first panel discussion, together with Lionel, we wanted to start local because we wanted to look at the different impact that this crisis can have on people, and because of the different publications I work for, I always try to think of the small villages and small municipalities, because globalization is not perceived the same way, whether you, depending on whether you live in a small village or in a big metropolis. And there's also been a public debate that pitted together Paris against the rest of the country, rural areas versus urban areas. So is it the right way to look at this question? Let me introduce our 6 guests. We're delighted to have them amongst us, even though they are away and not with us. So Kevin O'Rourke, you're a professor at New York University in Abu Dhabi. You are the head of Dentsu, and Caroline Fairbairn, you are the Director General of the CBI. Sergei Guriev, you're a professor in economy at Sciences Po for the Center of Economic Policy Research. And Michael O'Sullivan, who's with us. You are the author, amongst others, of The Leveling, What's Next After Globalization? How could we translate the leveling? How can we reconstruct, reinvent and rebalance, possibly, in the world to come? And next to me, Lionel Fontagné, who's a member of Cercle des Économistes. Hello. I'll let you introduce the topic for this panel discussion. Well, backlash to globalization. This health crisis has found in globalization the perfect suspect because of the movement of people on an international scale that has of course, favored the spread of the virus. There's also more and more distance between producers and consumers for a number of essential medical products and devices. And we have to also admit to the fact that globalization has not always been respectful of the environment. So a number of alerts have been sounded. Of course, there's been SRAS 17 years ago. There's been H1N1 influenza A 10 years ago, and Ebola virus in Africa only 5 years ago. So alarm has been sounded many times before, but the relevant measures have not necessarily been taken in terms of stocking drugs and medical devices, for example. Some simple remedies have been talked about. You've mentioned them. Should we reshore? Should we deglobalize? Should we work on regaining our independence? Good news for the people who promote that agenda is that deglobalization has already started. Actually, it started even before COVID-19, when Fukushima took place and when there were floods in Thailand. Companies realized that their fragmented value chain constituted a risk. Global trade also collapsed following the 2008-2009 crisis, and it never really recovered. In China, the refocusing of the economy on the domestic market also was part and parcel of a certain deglobalization. And more recently, since 2008, we've had a trade war between the US and China that doesn't seem to be about to abate. And there are technical innovations such as robotics and 3D printing that might make globalization a bit less essential. So deglobalization has already started. So that should please the promoters of the agenda for deglobalization. The bad news is that it will come at a cost, because productivity will drop, because competition will drop, and because the variety of the offer to companies and consumers for intermediate products will be lesser, and there will be less in terms of purchasing power. As economists, of course, we always want to put figures on evolutions and changes, you know. So there have been many economic studies, pretty thorough ones, to try and measure what that cost would be. Well, if we consider that the cost is sort of the reverse side of globalization, it would be 1,000 euros per household per year, which is a significant cost. So costs and at the same time, deglobalization will not solve the problem that globalization has already caused. Who will lose out? Well, the low-skilled people with the repetitive tasks who produce goods with low added value, or who are in labor pools with lower skills. None of this will be corrected or rectified by deglobalization. So if you give it a bit more thought, you realize that globalization and technical advances often have the same effects, and quite often it's difficult to separate globalization from technical advances. You can't hinder, you can't stop technical progress, whereas you can certainly try to stop globalization, and that's good news. So to discuss this subject, I want to thank our six distinguished guests. Well, if I heard correctly, Lionel Fontanier, you said that reshoring might be a bit of a simplistic remedy. I hope we can discuss it. To start, you said that deglobalization has already started. What do you think, Kevin O'Rourke? Do you think that there's a slowing down of globalization, or is it the end of a cycle? Could COVID-19 actually fasten that process? Well, I think we need to distinguish between globalization as a state of the world and globalization as a process. We live in a world that is extremely globalized, and even if there weren't any free trade agreement in the future to be signed, we would still live in a globalized world, a heavily globalized world. Sometimes I think that people who advocate for deglobalization make one mistake, which is that globalization has always been a race forward. But that's not the case. And I think it might be cautious to say, we won. We live in a very open world, and we should consolidate what we have by actually tackling what's at the root of some political movements that fight deglobalization. We've really seen that in the 19th century, for example, after 30 or 40 years of globalization provoked by new technologies and the steam power, there was a violent response by property owners and land owners that found themselves faced with strong competition without having access to cheap land in the New World. And then in the 21st century, you find the workers that are in competition with cheap labor elsewhere in the world. So I personally think, and I truly believe, studies that prove quite convincingly that Chinese competition has caused significant economic damage in parts of the world that they targeted more. There's unemployment. We've seen wages go down, health problems, and we've seen political damage. Thinking of Trump, and I think liberals can't turn a blind eye to that. I think there's a cause and effect link. And the second example I wanted to talk about is the 30s, the 1930s. The cause was not so much trade flows than capital flows. We saw huge capital flows going from the US to Germany in particular that made it possible for the Germans to pay back the debt from the Versailles Treaty. And once that had started, we saw Germany collapse with the consequences, disastrous consequences that we saw. And there's an echo of that in 2010 and the crisis and capital flows that were sort of fueled by a kind of euphoria. And when those flows stopped, same way as when the flows from the US to Germany had stopped, that caused damage and fueled populism in Italy, for example. So it seems to me that proponents of globalization admit to the fact that globalization causes certain problems. So you should never exaggerate anything. Globalization has been useful. It's made it possible for poor countries to exit poverty. And that's morally important. But when you push it too far, then there'll be reactions and responses and consequences that you can anticipate. One last word. I think proponents of multilateralism should really now shift gear and separate multilateralism and the all-powerful market if they mix up multilateralism and globalization, they would tarnish the image of multilateralism. We need multilateralism today more than ever politically to combat climate change mostly, but also to protect peace. So as to be able to guarantee peace. Thank you very much, Kevin O'Rourke. You are a professor at New York Abu Dhabi University. Thierry Jadot, you're the head of Dentsu Aegis Network. If you want to pick up on what Kevin O'Rourke said, how far should globalization go? So talking, should we go more towards multilateralism? I think we can see that there's a rejection of globalization, even though the divides that we see in our society existed before between the poor and the rich, between the one that have knowledge, the ones that don't have knowledge, the one that are forced to be displaced or move. And what's been very well said is that globalization, because it's focused on flows, it's left behind all the positive effects that globalization can have. So I think we should call for a globalization that could better serve human rights, health. What we can observe in the current rejection is that there's a sort of universalism of or universality of these divides and inequalities, and everybody can observe that in their country, well, in neighboring countries, there are quite similar problems to the ones they see in their country. So there's a need for a form of regulation, because globalization has also created a sort of extraterritoriality in terms of business that has become unacceptable. And there's also a rejection on the basis of some countries that find that the dependence has become toxic. What the first speaker has mentioned is the technological aspect, in particular in Europe. Europeans, business as well as citizens, are technologically dependent on the US and on China. And if we want to regain part of our sovereignty, this technological aspect is essential. Unfortunately, globalization has made addicts of us, a form of addiction. I was thinking of that during the lockdown period, because you can see that Italy, Spain, or Greece are addicted to mass tourism. That accounts for 15% of their GDP. And Germany is also addicted to globalization because it exports a lot to China and it imports raw materials from China. And it's true that automation does allow for a form of reshoring. Adidas, for example, they haven't opened a plant in Europe for decades. And thanks to automation, they've been able to open a plant in Germany. So I think there's a fight to be fought around technology. And if you listen to all the debate around Huawei, I think that's the main challenge for the future. In particular for Europe. So there's been a move towards deglobalization, or at least a rejection of globalization. So I agree, globalization and the rollout of technologies, I agree, has made it possible for a number of poor countries and African countries to come out of poverty. So that part of globalization is actually losing steam, but everything around soft power and robotics is picking up steam. So we might be moving towards less movements and less less traveling, but we're probably moving towards more soft power in the cultural dimension. I'm thinking of one example. South Korea, they got the Academy Award for Best Film. And that's the first time a foreign film has ever been awarded the Academy Award. And thanks to cinema, to Korean music, Korean pop is a huge phenomenon. So 11 out of 25 songs in the charts are now come now from Korea. So, so there's been a lot of debate about TikTok, and well, that's because. Indeed, globalization in the future will be about that soft power, which is culture. And we see Tencent, for example, acquiring more holding and in culture. It doesn't mean that because we deglobalize, we're not going to regionalize or come back to a regional scale. So what's really at stake, it's regaining our sovereignty, and we need to work on economy, we need to work on data privacy, we need to work on environment and on human rights. Those are the new frontiers of globalization. Many thanks, Thierry Jadot. Over to you, Ian Golding, here professor at Oxford University. So we'd like to get your stance and your response to what's been said by Thierry Jadot about the economic effect of globalization and that soft power, cultural globalization that might be a challenge in the future. Can you hear us, sir? Mr. Golding? Mr. Golden is here. Over to you, Mr. Golden. Can you see us? Can you hear us? Could someone tell Mr. Golden that the floor is his? Well, let's give the floor to Ms. Fairbairn. Oh, Mr. Golden is... So, Caroline Fairbairn, you are the Director General of the CBI. So, coming back to a more economic aspect, according to you, how should businesses reinvent their value chain so as to be more resilient? Do you think that the fragmentation in value chains could make for more resilience?
First of all, delighted to be here. I hope everyone can hear me, and congratulations to Aix-sur-Seine for keeping the show on the road. The economic shock of the pandemic to supply chains has been absolutely catastrophic. And I think it's an important starting point for this conversation around globalisation to really take stock of the economic impact and the potential impact on real families and real communities across the world. So, you know, the WTO predicts that global trade could fall in goods between 13% and 32% in 2020. And we have seen the impacts on the ground. The CBI, we speak for 190,000 businesses in the UK. And what we see is that they are seeing factory closures at home and abroad. Clearly, the Chinese pandemic, that was the start of it. Very soon after the closures in China, we saw supply chain problems in Europe, delays getting in and out of port, severe capacity constraints on air freight. And these are huge contributors to the compression in economies around the world. And one of the things I think is very important to acknowledge in this conversation around globalisation and where we take it is that we are heading into a period of massive recession around the world, with unemployment levels that we haven't seen for a long time. And what this means is that every percentage point of productivity is going to be worth fighting for. And so the answer to the supply chain contraction and compression must not be protectionism, because everything we know about the last, I would say, 100 years or more in terms of trade is that it is a net contributor to productivity, to job creation. Not perfect. No, we need to absolutely recognise the impacts in terms of fairness and regional distribution in particular. But the tendency towards protectionism, I think, is something that every business would want to see really resisted. We've seen from the benefits of tech innovation spreading globally, there will be major investments in sustainability, in healthcare that need to be shared globally. And if we want to address the challenges of unemployment that we're going to see in all our countries, I think resisting the tendency to protectionism that we are seeing will be paramount. That said, will supply chains need to become more resilient? Yes, they will. And I think some of the things that businesses that we speak to are looking at very carefully is the diversification of supply chain globally. Not necessarily the reshoring, because that comes with a productivity cost, but certainly the diversification and the idea that you would only have one supplier for one product. I think you will see many companies looking at that very differently. Now, there are also some supply chains which governments may well say are strategically crucial. We have seen that in testing kits, in PPE availability. And again, but that needs to be done in partnership with business so that it is done in a way that is job creating and protects the efficiency of supply chains. In terms of the other very important, I think, features of the resilient supply chain of the future will be three other features. First of all, I think resilient supply chains will have to be very focused on sustainability and the building in of net zero and climate change targets and goals. I think we will see that in supply chains across the world. I think, secondly, recognising the unfairness that has been highlighted by the pandemic, but which we was there before, in terms of how globalisation can really impact different communities. And I think the UK will have a policy of levelling up in its domestic policies. The government is very clear about that. It will involve investment really spreading out from London into the regions in terms of infrastructure, in terms of skills and education. That needs to be a very important antidote. And I think the third area will be the tech innovation and the digital innovation. Digital supply chains have been proven to be more resilient. Look at us now. The resilience of a digital environment faced with supply shocks is an answer that many firms have found to be very powerful during this pandemic. What one member said to me was they've seen 10 years of digital innovation compressed into 3 months, and how we turn that into resilience in the future. But I would just like to conclude with, I think, this very fierce warning that you will hear from many parts of business about the extent of the emergency that they are facing in employment, in survival. And that if we are to give them the best chance of creating prosperity for communities in all of our countries, resisting the temptation to turn inwards, to turn to protectionism, the future of the WTO and its multilateral role will be absolutely vital. This is a period of real jeopardy, I think, for global prosperity. Protectionism is not the answer. Building resilience into supply chains in others is. Thank you very much.
Merci Caroline Fairbairn. J'espère que
Thank you, Mrs. Fairbanks. I hope we'll have time to discuss some of the topics discussed during this first roundtable discussion, especially as Director General of the CBI. Well, reshoring has a cost, especially productivity. Well, you said that deglobalization would cost 10,000 euros per household and per year. I mean, those are items or points that we should discuss. And I want to know how you actually made the calculation. How do you work out the math? So, Mr. Goldin, now do you hear us, sir? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Were you able to hear the previous discussion? Yes. Hello. So, would you mind sharing your views on globalization, the impact on the economy, and that would come to affecting some economies and not others? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not hearing you.
non, vous nous...
Do you hear me, sir? Do you hear me, sir? Okay, good. You have the floor. I mean, did you hear the question, sir? Did you hear the question? Could we have your views? Okay. Could we? Yes, sure. Could we have your views on global economy and the impact on globalization? Now, yes. Okay. So you are with us. Thank you very much. Now you are now the next speaker in this roundtable discussion. Your contribution on the role of globalization on the economy of emerging countries, of advanced economies, and as well the trend and the direction, the heading it's taking. Thank you. Your answer.
Well, globalization is very good, very bad, and very ugly. And the impact on different economies depends totally on the way that economies have aged. If you compare, for example, China and the US, or in Europe, Denmark and the UK, you get a sense of how significant national policies are. It's in the end national countries that can determine how globalization impacts on them. We need to work collectively to stop the abuses of globalization, whether they are tax havens or whether they are the spread of diseases, viruses like COVID-19, climate change, and other threats that globalization brings. But clearly, what globalization brings is very much a two-edged sword. We can use it to overcome our challenges. We can use it to create a vaccine. We can use it to ensure we never have another pandemic. We can use it to climate change, and we can use it to spread prosperity around the world. But it can also be used to spread fake news, weapons, viruses, and very harmful things like fossil fuels. And so the challenge, I believe, is at the national and global management level. There's no doubt that emerging markets have grown more rapidly over the last 40 years than any time in history because of their access to global trade, capital markets, and most of importantly to the ideas of how you progress, whether it's progress on getting girls into school, whether it's human rights and gay marriage around the world, whether it's Black Lives Matter, the Me Too movement, or whether it is about how to run economies. The spreading of ideas is what leads to the most rapid progress. And if you kill globalization, you kill that as well as other dimensions. And so my view is that we need to see it as multifaceted. To say the world should deglobalize or has deglobalized, I think, is to only focus on one particular aspect, which is trade, in manufactured goods mainly, and that, in my view, is very one-sided. It's the breadth of the conversation that's necessary. It is the case that globalization has been associated with a deglobalization in many respects of politics. And that widening gulf between increasingly integrated systems, not least digital systems, and increasingly fragmented politics is my greatest worry. I think what Europe shows is you can be in a highly integrated system, and the European countries have given up even their independent defense policies, their foreign policies, their border controls to Brussels, that you can be in that and maintain your national identity. And I think we need to understand the broader implications of this at the global level, because we are going to make some sacrifices, not least on climate change, not least on managing health and pandemics, to global authorities, if we want to ensure that we can live in harmony. That growing divide between a fragmented political world, the withdrawal of support from international organizations, and our integrated system is the greatest challenge we face. My hope is that Europe does not get sucked in to the Cold War 2.0 between the US and China. And the key for Europe, in my view, is to ensure that it is able to work with partners around the world, including, of course, China, to manage big global threats. Coalitions of the working, coalitions of countries that to stop climate change, stop the next pandemic, and to close down tax havens and other really necessary, urgent activities are required. And if we wait for all countries, and if we for the US particularly, to agree to this, we'll be waiting for too long. So the key challenge is how, in a globalized world, do you organize these coalitions to manage globalization, even if key players like the US are not part of them? But clearly, we need to understand that globalization, while the biggest force for progress in the history of humanity, is also the most dangerous force. Killing it is not the answer. The only answer is managing it. And those countries that understand this and are willing to, moving fastest and acting to ensure that we can manage it.
Merci beaucoup, Yann Goldin. Je rappelle que vous êtes professeur.
Thank you very much, Mr. Goldin, your teacher at Oxford. So now, Sergei Griev, hello. Sergei Griev. So, what is the role of this backlash of the outcry on globalization, the role of social networks? So, the outcry
that Kevin and Jan and Lionel were talking about the fact that many jobs have been displaced by competition with imports from low-wage countries, by automation, which is also related to globalization. And of course, what we see is the rise of populists who take advantage of those dislocations. And we also see that populists benefit greatly from social media. Currently, we do see, and there is empirical evidence, and in particular, I do research on this, we see that populist politicians so far have been more successful exploiting social media. And this is one other aspect of spinning the message about the costs of globalization, use of modern information and telecommunications technology. Now, the question is what to do about that. And I think while we need to think about how to present liberal democratic message on online media, we also need to address the very basic issues that are related to the costs and dislocations of globalization. And this is what Jan and Kevin and Lionel were talking about. Those workers who lose their jobs due to competition with imports, due to globalization, due to automation, should have a chance to retrain. Their kids should have access to education and healthcare. And this is where, for example, Anglo-Saxon countries, in particular United States, are underperforming relative to European countries, especially to Nordic European countries, to Nordic countries, to North European countries. Another issue is, of course, what Jan was talking about. There is a major case for making globalization fair, which means we need to fight tax havens. We need to make sure that everybody pays a fair share of taxes. And this is by definition a global project, a multilateral project, and luckily we see some progress there, although there are major hiccups, including from those populist leaders who already came to power. In particular, the United States occasionally slows down its cooperation in that particular project. And finally, of course, globalization should be green. We should make sure that the global competition does not destroy the planet. And for that, we can only praise the efforts, again, probably slow, probably delayed, but efforts of European Commission to introduce a green tax and border tax adjustment. This is extremely important to make global competition contributing to fighting climate change rather than to destroying the planet. And if we make these three things, the inclusion, access to public goods, education, first, the fairness, meaning that we fight tax evasion and tax optimization, some companies call it, in the global marketplace. And three, if we make globalization greener, then I think there is a message we can sell and stand up to populists who criticize but do not offer an alternative solution. But first we need to fix our own house, to put our own house in order, and then we can stand up to forces that actually point to the problems but do not offer solutions. So I think that social media are important, but what is more important is not the platform, but the actual message, the actual state of affairs. Thank you.
Ah, nous avons perdu la liaison, je crois que de conclure.
You were concluding, Sergei Griev. We'll hear you in a minute. So we'll close the roundtable with you, Michael O'Sullivan. Thank you for being with us in this studio in Maison de la Radio. You heard the previous speakers. Yourself have things to say. Certainly, maybe talk about the long reflection that fueled this book, The Leveling of Questions. So what would be the aspect of a post-globalization economy? Thank you for the very kind invitation. I'm very happy to take part in this discussion. It would be much nicer in Aix-en-Provence, but anyway, you know, let's face it, we're in Paris.
Globalization is dead. That's a pity. It was a better world. But I think we have to set our minds now to a new world that is coming. And globalization started with the fall of communism. It allowed the flow of ideas, the flow of commerce, and the flow of people. And if you want an event or a bookmark to signal the end of globalization, it is what's happening in Hong Kong. It cuts off the flow of ideas, people, finance, and commerce. And if you measure globalization, trade, ideas, all those indicators have been slowing, and now they've been ruptured by the COVID crisis. That's been a big test, which effectively has ended globalization. Also, the countries who have been leading globalization, the US, the UK, are in trouble with Brexit and institutionally, politically in the US. People like Mr. Trump are vandalizing the institutions of the 20th century, the World Trade Organization. So to answer the question, where are we going? The world economy after globalization will be a more indebted one. We will have world debt to GDP levels not seen since the Napoleonic Wars. It'll be a world of more friction, maybe less, unfortunately, less cooperation, but also a world more intensively driven by technology and technology-driven industries. And I don't think, to stress Caroline Fairbairn's point, I don't think ripping up supply chains is the way to go. They are incredibly complex. They worked well during the COVID crisis. And if I was a politician in Europe, and interestingly this week in my country, England, I'm in France in the last 2 hours, we have new governments. And they have to face up to this world. And the essential characteristic of the post-globalization world would be a multi-polar world dominated by 3 large regions who do things increasingly differently. So if you look at the response to the COVID crisis, the Chinese were very severe, very strict. Europe rested on its social welfare system, and in the US, the debate was more tilted towards the economy. Again, look at the internet. Europe doesn't have its own internet. It regulates the world internet. The US has these tech giants, and then China has a wall around its internet. We will see the same in other areas. So I think if you are, whoever the new Minister of Finance, Minister of Europe is in France or Ireland, I think they have 3 challenges, and Europe has got 3 challenges. The first is mentality. So in Europe, we have to realize and adjust to the fact that this multipolar world is happening and become more strategic. And in a pragmatic and tangible way, Brussels needs to change the way it works. It needs to be faster, learn the lessons of recent and previous crises. The other change of mentality is in growth. And I'm not necessarily a capitalist, but and I know in some economies in Europe, the idea of growing your economy fast is a sort of dirty word. But on a continent where we have so much debt and where we have lots of young people, growth is the only way forward. And also when our 2 big competing partners, the US and China, are growing at a high rate, that's the only way for Europe to proceed. And if I reflect on the Macron government, they've done lots of things that help entrepreneurship, but there's not yet the narrative and mentality of growth. So that's one thing. The other, I think, is pragmatic harmonization. So one idea there is, instead of handicapping all countries by having the same fiscal policy, why not have the same approach in all countries to setting up a business in a common, speedy way? And I think also Europe needs to get to grips with how it does innovation. There's lots of talk, and you talk to the commissioner later on about doing innovation in Europe. And I don't think it's best done top down from the state. I think you have to incentivize and enable entrepreneur and talented people in Europe to do that. And then finally, one trend we will see more of in Europe is this whole idea of European values. And again, that's a conversation that's had much better from the bottom up with people as opposed to impose. And it will also have to interrogate the investment by Russia and China in Eastern Europe. And there will be, I think, along the line, a sense that these countries have to choose whose side they're on. So to finish, we've entered a new world order, lots of challenges for not just the new government in Paris, but politicians across Europe.
Merci beaucoup, Michael O'Sullivan.
Thank you, Mr. O'Sullivan. The conditions of such meetings do not make it possible to be as flexible as in a normal situation. Yeah. But as you said, you said key things. We'd like to have now a kind of feedback and a discussion. We might do a second roundtable discussion, shorter though. So you do, Mr. Goldin, Jadot, and so on, want to say for after the previous, having heard the previous speakers, and I'm sure you all have strong ideas. So globalization is dying, sort of, and you have new answers in the way you see this and the way you actually receive that news. Mr. O'Rourke. Two comments. Well, the death of globalization is a bit an excess of terminology. Well, some countries wish sure because sometimes, because they don't want to be over-dependent on China or the supplying countries. But, well, that's not deglobalization. It's business which do sensible things for their own turnover. For me, deglobalization would be there if the interaction costs between countries would sharply increase because of custom duties or so on and so forth. This is why companies would actually pull out of a country. So that's the first nuance. Now, and I think the difference I make between globalization at different levels the trends, well, it's important. We always have an open, we have to be open to the world, let's face it. But second comment, this is why my contradictor was saying, we're going towards a multipolar world. That's obvious. That was obvious in the last 20 years. We are heading toward a multipolar world, and it worries me significantly because a multipolar world is a dangerous world. Let's face it, the world before World War I was a multipolar. It was a multipolar, globalized world. So, trade does not necessarily bring peace. There are political processes that could go into the other direction. And I'm worried about Europe. I'm worried because there is a kind of a naive and idealistic utopian from the Europeans, and they think they confuse the rule of law within Europe, but between nation states in Europe, and on the other side there are interactions between the major powers, and we cannot interact with China and the U.S. the way we interact between the French and there are interactions between the French and the Germans. That's not the way it works. So your president is right. We need to find a form of strategic independence, but unfortunately, I don't quite believe in that. I'm not too optimistic. We should not be over-dependent from the U.S. for IT technology or healthcare equipment and so on and so forth. But, unfortunately, we do depend on the U.S. and we cannot rely on Nokia. We should not rely just on Nokia, Ericsson and we continue the Nord Stream. So are we going to spend more on for defense? I mean, and the answer to the question is that we're going to handle things. If the answer is that we're going to handle things, okay, we may talk about strategic independence. But but if we let things to go, or in all directions as it was before, I think they're going to be a problem. Thank you, Thierry Jadot. Back to what you heard. Could you clarify what you wanted to say earlier on the fractures that we face, periphery, noble population, or forced nomadization? It's not the result of globalization. And I mean, do you wish to react to this? Well, often when we talk about reshoring, often we we see delocalization or reshoring or offshoring and reshoring as cost purely. We analyze it as cost, but the modification, transformation of the usage of consumers means that we could create business opportunity by reshoring because we want to more custom-made or local products. So reshoring is not necessarily a cost if it comes up with business opportunities. Yes, indeed, fractures did not pre-exist globalization, but globalization, which was only focused on trade and commerce, and it does increase the fracture. One player was mentioned, Europe. When we see the fragmentation of multilateralism, 3 blocks now, Europe should stop being scared of itself. It has to spread its regalian functions because it is in regulation now. It is on author's right, on protection of personal data. But in the meantime, because we don't realize, but such regulations are being imposed to most global players. So it has a role to play in the future, not just by asserting its values, but by opening its regalian field and not just free trade, in which it evolved so far. And it is the only way, beyond regulation, this is the only way we can impose other value on human rights, environmental protection, and so on and so forth. But globalization is shrinking, but it leads to regionalization. The feeling I have is that the world, in a way, in this quite odd period, expect more from Europe and not less. And where we do face a challenge is that we are not mastering technologies, and the world that is coming will be under the control of technologies. And China and the US today control technologies that will control the world. And this is a challenge. There we need champions, European champions, and we have to completely reshuffle the system that will lead to the creation of champions. It is too scattered in Europe, regardless of the domain of activity. We need European champions to be more innovative, more disruptive, and because technology will be the future. Now, by way of conclusion, Thierry Jadot, Caroline Fairbank will respond rapidly because I will respond to Thierry and to the fact that we should start. He said that we should. You said reshoring. He says reshoring should not be associated with cost. Well, you say reshoring as a cost, so you disagree with him. And rapidly on the way, the British industry are taking a stand in this new globalization. But could you please be brief, madam?
I'll be very brief. The conversation around politics and major global forces can seem very disconnected from the lives of ordinary people in communities. And one of the biggest goals that I think governments will have over this next period of extreme economic pain will to build good green jobs close to home. And that ought to be the guiding objective of leaders who are seeking to do the best for their countries. And that will require a very measured approach to some of the political arguments that we've just heard. Good green jobs close to home requires shared technology advances. It requires a shared solution on climate change. It requires free and fair trade. And we as a business community would urge that economic priority of creating prosperity for communities to drive decision-making rather than global geopolitics.
Merci.
Thank you very much. We have to move forward. I want to thank the interpreters because there have been technical glitches they've had to fight. Many thanks. We'll wrap up. Michael O'Sullivan, you wanted to respond to what's just been said.
The theme that's emerging is that Europe needs to grow up and wake up. And part of the problem we have is that things are happening so quickly. we never had such a fast crisis and a fast response. And what I would love to see is just a period of reflection and informal discussion by European governments on maybe two things. They're all trying to stimulate their economies, but they should ask, are there better, more efficient ways they can do it together? The recovery program is one thing that's in place. And also, I think one of the lessons we've learned is that the COVID crisis has been handled very differently by individual countries across Europe. So without blaming it, there is room for people just looking around and learning lessons, saying, why did Germany do differently to France? Why did Ireland do better than Britain? But in a sort of formal, friendly way that just advances everybody at the same time.
Et d'autres méthodes. Merci à vous, Yann Goldin.
Many thanks. Ian Goldin, can you hear us? Do you want to say a few words of conclusion?
On n'entend pas Monsieur Goldin. Alors,
So we can't hear you.
Selon si on arrive à
So we can't hear Mr. Goldin, so we'll give the floor to Mr. Guriev and we'll try and get Mr. Goldin back on the line. Mr. Guriev, over to you.
Non plus. Alors,
we can't hear Mr. Guriev either. Lionel Fontanier, did you want to say a few words of conclusion? Well, thank you very much for these different stances and opinions. We apologize to the speakers whose opinions and developments have been cut short because of technical glitches, but we've nonetheless heard many very interesting opinions and views. The first takeaway from me is that the divides and inequalities pre-existed globalization. I think what globalization did is that because it focused on freeing movement and trade, it's revealed and underlined maybe those divides and the changes without the governments actually giving enough support to drive this change. We've heard also the necessity to regain autonomy over our environment. So faced with these challenges, we've heard different leads and avenues worth exploring, and that's always a good thing to wrap up with avenues to explore. So consolidate globalization and think outside the box of globalization. If we start by consolidating globalization, we should look at the root of the rejection over globalization. And the main root, the main cause is inequalities. We've heard also about the necessity to fight tax evasion, bad use of social networks. These things should be really taken seriously by governments if we want this globalization to be strengthened. Technical progress has also been mentioned as a way, if we use it right, to fight our dependence. So let's repair the ship so as to become stronger. So we have to rethink globalization. Everyone agreed to say that globalization should be more sustainable. And also there are other non-economic dimensions that we need to factor in. We talked about culture, the free flow of ideas, and things that COVID-19 has actually slowed down and made more difficult over the last few weeks. So it is about proactive government policies. We talked about Nordic countries and their different models. So often we look at them with a slightly exaggerated awe in France. But and the third avenue worth exploring, which is the most radical. We are in a post-globalization world, aka multipolar world. It is a dangerous world. We've talked about the division in 3 blocks, the fragmentation in 3 blocks that can pose some geopolitical perils. But it's also a world in which multilateral institutions are under attack. We've talked about WTO, which is under attack by the US. And this multipolar world with 3 main regions would have to face up to 3 main challenges. The first is to change mindset, to be more strategic. And I think this new European Commission, that is also called the Commission of Last Resort, of the last chance, has understood that, and they've kick-started something different. Europe has often been accused of being too naive. I think it's not naive anymore. It's on the offensive and not on the defensive anymore. So that's the first challenge to face up in this multipolar world. Secondly, and that's the economist speaking, we need to generate growth. And to pay our debt and to recover from this crisis, we'll need to generate more growth, also because of the demographics. And it's true that in different parts of Europe, there are different customs, there are different visions. I'm thinking of the tax system. We'll have to harmonize our rules and to make it so that life can be as harmonious as possible in these regions. And lastly, since the world is a dangerous place and since we need hope to face up to the challenge, I share what's been said by many speakers. The best defense against these dangers is to always abide by the European values that have been the basis for the building of the European Union. Many thanks to Lionel Fontanier, and many thanks to all our speakers, and many thanks to Michael for joining us in the flesh. Have a nice day.